For over 2 billion people in the world today, the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, is sacred scripture. For hundreds of scholars across the globe, it is an invaluable window on an ancient culture from which few other voices remain. Although we sometimes think of the Bible as a single book, it's more like a library, consisting of many texts written at various times and in various places. Any attempt to understand the meaning of these texts, or the histories and cultures they reflect, inevitably encounters one important question. When were these texts written? After centuries of study, scholars are more divided than ever. These differences in date affect the way we read these texts. Take, for example, the famous story of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is his father's favorite son, and his brothers are jealous of his status. Overcome by their hatred for him, they have him sent to Egypt as a slave and tell their father he is dead. When these brothers unexpectedly reunite with Joseph in Egypt, he is now the highest official in the Egyptian royal court, and it's because of him that they escape a famine. According to one scholarly view, this story was composed in the northernmost of two rival kingdoms. In this northern kingdom, there were tribes that traced their ancestry to Joseph, and the kingdom itself was often called the house of Joseph. So by telling a story in which Joseph is chosen over his brothers, the story is implying that this northern kingdom has the right to rule over its southern neighbor, where they trace their ancestry primarily to Judah, one of Joseph's brothers. But this view clearly only makes sense if the story was composed while the northern kingdom existed. That is, between, at the earliest, 930 BCE, and at the latest, 720. Other interpretations of this story also depend on the dates, and all told, the differences among scholars on the date of this story exceed 700 years. As a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, I'm fascinated with these differences in date and their implications. And working together with colleagues, I've developed a new approach to the question, a statistical and computational method that uses language to date ancient texts. For my project, I apply the method to Hebrew, which is the language of these texts, but the method itself does not depend upon the language. So I'll begin with a few examples in English to make the basics clear. Let's suppose you go searching through an archive of English texts, and you find several that have no date attached, and you want to determine it. You know that all the texts in the archive are from sometime between 1800 and the present, but nothing more. To determine the date using the language, you would gather other texts for which you know the date, and you would compare that with the frequency of different words within those texts. And you would aim to identify changes in the language over time. Some of the cases that you would encounter would be simple, and the conclusions that follow would be obvious, without any need for a statistical or computational approach. Let's suppose you found a novel that contained the word iPhone, with a capital P. As you examine the words from 1800 and work your way toward the present, you would find almost no examples of the term until there's a sudden spike in usage right around 2007. With such clear differences over time, there would be almost no question that this novel was written sometime between 2007 and the present. Other cases, however, would be a bit more difficult to handle. Suppose you found a short story that contained the old-fashioned word thou. It would be clear from your evidence that the frequency decreased over time, but the word is still used even today, so there's additional uncertainty that needs to be taken into account. And further, to fully take advantage of this evidence, you would need to begin calculating rates of change. As you proceed, you attempt to combine both pieces of evidence together, gathering for each text whether it contains the word iPhone, whether it contains the word thou, and how often. And now the problem must be represented in 3 dimensions. Each additional term adds yet more dimensions. In fact, these are only 2 of many possible terms that could have changed over time. So if we want to get the best dates, we have to search over all of the terms in all of the novels. And not only this, but many combinations of the many terms to find the one that will best predict the date. And now the problem has become extremely complex. When we now go to date texts in the Hebrew Bible, we have all of these same complicating factors, but to them we add one more. If these were English texts, we could match a frequency of a particular word with a particular date. But for Hebrew texts, we instead have only a range of dates. We know that each text was written before some date and after another, but little more. And every year between these maximum and minimum dates must be taken into account. This means that in order to determine the change of even one word, we must take into account all of the combinations of all of the possible years across all of the books. And when we combine this with the other complications we already saw, we now have a dizzying array of possibilities to consider. Simply stated, no human scholar could ever take all of this in at once. It's no wonder, then, that scholars arrive at such vastly different dates. But in our method, each aspect of the complexity becomes a separate part of a concise mathematical expression, and all of these issues can be simultaneously taken into account. The results, so far, are surprising. One of the main conclusions among scholars who had examined the language before was that many texts in the Hebrew Bible were written before 600 BCE. But our initial results suggest that these same texts were written after that date. And among those texts is the Joseph story. Now, some might think that the use of a quantitative method should settle the issue of dates once and for all, but I think of it differently. The conclusions in these methods are meant to be updated. At any given point, we can assess the accuracy of our method using the resources of the method itself, but the goal will always be to improve that accuracy ever more over time by including more evidence, improving our statistical techniques, and continuing the dialogue. Taken separately, both humanistic and quantitative approaches have their own respective strengths. But if we can bring them together, then we can shed new light on some very old questions.